be Eckart Naumann from, oh, it's not allowing me to share, there we go. Is Eckart Naumann from Tralac. Eckart, thanks for joining us today, Eckart. Just to give a basic intro to Eckart. He's an economist. He's based in South Africa. His research and consulting work spans a range of sectors and subjects, with a focus on market access issues and rules of origin, where he assisted the SADC, EAC, ESA, and West Africa EPA programs in their preparations for negotiating revised rules of origin with the EU. He has also had a particular interest in USA-Africa trade and AGOA, and has been involved in many research and related capacity building activities in his field through the years. He has created the agoa.info platform, which we use a lot, and we drive people to throughout this program. And he did this at the time, right back when AGOA's inceptions 2 decades ago, which he continues to manage. And I know they're doing a large project at the moment, revising a lot of things. A lot of it's mostly done to agoa.info. And just updating this and making it easier and simpler for people to access that information through AGOA. Eckart works for Tralac, which is the Trade Law Center. He's an associate there. And it's, as mentioned, it's currently supported by the USA Prosper Africa Program, Africa Trade and Investment Initiative. We work very closely and get advice from Eckart all the time. So thank you, Eckart, again for joining us. I'll let you share your screen now and give us some more information on a basic understanding of AGOA's key provisions and some practical steps to establish product eligibility and tariff classification. Yours.
Okay. Just had to find the unmute button. Can you hear me, Rex, or everyone?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Rex. Thanks for the long intro. That was far longer than I would have wanted. Much appreciated, and thank you for your all your I don't want to use the word enthusiasm, but there is obviously a lot of enthusiasm for your energy you put into promoting those linkages and AGOA and everything around it. You do great work, and your passion is palpable. So thank you very much for that. And also thank you to the previous two speakers. I found those two presentations absolutely fascinating and fantastic. And always, I'm always on the learning curve. So especially on the nitty-gritty bolts of trading, which a lot of it, not being a trader myself. That is certainly very interesting. Now, just I am coming here into it at the end of it, but obviously it links into the discussion early on. Of course the logistics. I mean, I heard the previous presentation already, and I'm likewise. I'm still on a learning curve on some of the nitty-gritty on exporting. And obviously it's very technical. And I do appreciate, Ron, those insights that you shared with us. Rex asked me to talk about two things, basically, and I'm going to marry them into one fairly brief presentation. One, on the one hand, given the topic of exporting and focus on America, the kind of the program that makes it easier, not absolutely necessary and not essential, but certainly easier to export to the American market, and that's the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, the nuts and bolts of that, the key characteristics, the key requirements, and kind of taking a brief look into the future. As many of you probably know, at this stage, AGOA is set to expire in September 2025. So we've got a little bit over 2 years left of this program as it stands. There are rumblings about some changes and extensions and so on, but until that actually happens, it's a matter of Congress to decide. At this stage, AGOA expires at the end of September 2025. And then More importantly, and at a much more practical level, given the audience as well, is just using some of the tools, some of the easily available tools, how to establish whether your product, and that is kind of essentially a question that Rex always has, and kind of a bit of a central theme, ensuring whether your product is AGOA eligible in the first place, and how do you check that? And linked to that is, how do you check your classification code for that product, because those two are obviously very linked. Without the classification code, you cannot establish your AGOA eligibility. And with that, there are various ways of using online tools, download tools, documents, but I'm going to just walk you through on just an easy way of establishing that in the last couple of slides, and we'll do a practical example. Now, let me just move on my presentation. Yeah, so in terms of the 2 points, and I don't need to kind of repeat much of this now, is really just a brief overview of the key features of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which makes your products more competitive in the United States market, or in most instances, certainly. And secondly, just those practical considerations and tools available to you free of charge, how to establish your product's AGOA eligibility status and classification code. Now, briefly just starting, and again, just painting a bit of a framework picture. Many of you will be fairly familiar with this, probably, especially those that are already exporting. But again, it's always worth mentioning again, you might be the exporter, but on the other side of the coin is a US importer. And the US importer does a lot of the paperwork and a lot of the clearing into the United States commerce, and is also essentially the party that claims the preference. So you might consider yourself the indirect beneficiary of AGOA. It makes your products more competitive to the buyer, but the buyer claims the preference, and unless you are also the importer into the US directly. But it's the buyer, your buyer, that ultimately benefits directly from a preferential arrangement. So on the one hand, obviously, AGOA is much more than just something that gives African produced products better access to the United States market. It is a platform for non-reciprocal meaning the United States is giving African beneficiary countries this preference, not vice versa. It's not a trade agreement. It is not something that is negotiated. It is a part of US legislation that provides preferential market access to a large number of products into the United States if they are manufactured in an eligible beneficiary sub-Saharan African country. And I'll say something more on that in the next slide, I think. It is also a forum for deeper US-Africa engagement. So it's much more than only about providing trade preferences. It's literally a forum. The AGOA legislation mandates an annual forum where the private sector, civil society, and governments get together. That has fallen away slightly, or rather has taken place in a slightly different format over the last 2-3 years because of COVID, but certainly before then, and expected to be this year again in South Africa. The AGOA Forum brings together a lot of people, and there's also a lot of matchmaking at the forum. So certainly, something that was alluded to early on, the importance of that. The forum is certainly the private sector aspects of the forum are an important vehicle for that, and that is facilitated by the AGOA legislation. It is a channel for technical development and business support, and this is not to be sniffed at. The United States is investing heavily in this relationship and provides a lot of assistance. There were some mentions of, for example, of the Trade Hub. The Trade Hubs are because of the AGOA legislation. There are changes in the format of the support at the moment. So, for example, the Trade Hubs, as they used to exist, have come to an end, but it's been taken over essentially in a slightly different format called Africa Trade and Investment, or falls under the Prosper Africa banner. And it is basically a mechanism that brings together a lot of organizations and stakeholders and government departments to deliver an even better support structure to particularly to African exporters. So it's both development, technical, and business support. And in fact, the reason why we are here together falls into this category, the support that is provided through the United States Agency for International Development. And then, of course, helping facilitate US-Africa investment. That is something that the United States has become more and more keen on over the last couple of years, that it is not simply a matter of getting African countries to export to the United States, but also facilitating US investment in Africa. And it all falls under this broad AGOA banner and collaboration. In terms of the history, and again, this is quite a dense looking slide, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, but the most important takeaway is AGOA has been around since 2000, so it's been literally 23 years of preferences, non-reciprocal preferences available to exporters, but it is coming to an end as it stands on the 30th of September in 2025. So not that much time to go. It is not the only preference scheme there is or has been over the years. There's also the generalized system of preferences, and I'll say something about that because it is something that is still being misunderstood quite a bit. And the reason why I say it's being misunderstood is because US importers or US import agents are still clearing goods under the GSP into the United States from African AGOA beneficiary countries. And the GSP is currently not authorized. In other words, no preferences are possible under this. There'll be a delay in obtaining any preferential entry if you are clearing goods under the GSP. Those same products can also be cleared under AGOA, and you get your immediate duty-free access. But a sizable amount of trade is still taking place under GSP on paper, with no preferences being available to the importer and by extension to the exporter. Those products are not as competitive in the US markets as they should be. The countries that have a color are those countries that are currently AGOA eligible. There are 35 countries as of 2023. One country lost its AGOA eligibility at the beginning of this year, and 3 countries lost their AGOA eligibility status at the end of the previous year. And that is for not complying with AGOA's eligibility requirements, which are quite extensive. There was a slide early on where some of these were alluded to. It's beyond what I want to focus on today. But certainly, AGOA is non-reciprocal, but it's not unconditional. If countries do not meet these AGOA eligibility requirements, the rule of respect for the rule of law, and, for example, allowing unionization and political pluralism and all kinds of, about 8 or 9 categories of criteria, they do run the risk of being suspended as an AGOA beneficiary status. And it is something that has happened to a couple of countries. So that is the current situation. If it's a country that is not gray, it is AGOA eligible. There are different categories of AGOA eligible countries in terms of only one provision, and those are the textiles and clothing provisions. So separate regulations apply to textiles and clothing exports, and a country needs to implement a AGOA visa system or textile visa system. They're called the wearing apparel provisions. And only a country that has satisfied the United States that it has implemented such a system may export textiles and clothing under AGOA preference. So if it is a blue country, it has a light blue country, it is AGOA eligible. Those countries in kind of from Angola northwards, and 1 or 2 in West Africa and Djibouti as well in the east, and Rwanda as well. Those countries are AGOA eligible for everything but textiles and clothing. The dark blue countries are AGOA eligible for all their products, or all AGOA eligible products, including textiles and clothing. And South Africa is a different color for the reason that the rules of origin, the local manufacturing requirements, the local content requirements, if you're an exporter from South Africa, are quite different to those from the other AGOA eligible countries. South Africa was considered to be too advanced to be benefiting from the so-called third country fabric provisions, and has to use locally made fabric or fabric sourced from another AGOA country, made in another AGOA country, which in turn also has to be made from African-made yarn. So it's effectively a triple transformation requirement for African or South African exporters versus the other AGOA eligible countries that can source fabrics from anywhere in the world, and are also allowed to export textiles, in other words, fabrics and yarns and so on, to the United States duty-free. So that is the picture, 35 countries. What also is maybe something I should mention here is under the accumulation provisions of AGOA, you do have the rules of origin require that you need to have a certain amount of local content. And effectively, and it's more technical than that, but 35% local content is the requirement to be an AGOA eligible product. It's got to be on the list, but also it has to be made in that AGOA eligible country. In other words, 35% of the cost of materials and processing has to be local. The rules of origin for textile and clothing, as I mentioned, are a little bit different. But those 35% don't necessarily have to be only from national sources. They can also be from other AGOA beneficiary sources. So a South African company could, for argument's sake, source certain materials from Botswana or Lesotho or Namibia and use it as locally made, local content in order to fulfill the 35% minimum content rule. But again, also, today is not about the rules of origin, but I think it is worth mentioning in terms of the broader picture of what makes the product potentially AGOA eligible. It has to be on the list of AGOA eligible products, and it has to be originating in the exporting country. And how does it originate? It originates if it is at least 35% local content, and that's made up of materials and processing costs. Let me just move on to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. Now, in terms of what products are AGOA eligible, or what is the scale of AGOA preferences, it is quite vast. It does not cover all products, but I think in this little very basic chart that I try to knock up in a very, very simple way, the important thing is, if you're an exporter in an AGOA eligible country, is that red bar at the top. 3% of total tariff lines, and that's only about 250 tariff lines in total. Only those are still dutiable if exported from an AGOA country. So of the 11,000 or so, 11,500 or whatever it is, the exact number, of possible tariff lines, possible products that can be exported into the United States, only 3% are still dutiable if it's coming from an AGOA eligible country, like South Africa or Namibia or Kenya. Now, a fairly large percentage, the green bar, are those that are duty-free anyway. They do not need AGOA. They are duty-free irrespective of where they come from. So that's another 37%. 60%, the important thing, AGOA or AGOA GSP, as I have, /GSP. And I only have it as /GSP because those products also, or many of those products, have the special program indicator of the GSP as part of the US tariff code. Does not mean GSP is currently valid. And in fact, if you try to import, as I mentioned earlier on, under GSP, you will not be able to claim a preference at the moment. Or certainly, whatever preference there is will be held by US Customs and will only be paid out to you whenever the GSP gets reauthorized. It's been expired for over 2 years already. Okay, so that's quite important to know. The dark blue, so the blue bars, the light blue and the dark blue are AGOA categories. Roughly 6,700 tariff lines are made up, are represented by these two bars. Round about 5,000 are AGOA and GSP. So if you're in GSP eligible country like Thailand or another country, you can claim duty-free access to the United States. Or if you're from South Africa, you can claim duty-free access, or rather, maybe I'm not going to use South Africa as an example because there's a rider on that, and I'll mention that just now. But if you're Lesotho, you can also, those GSP tariff lines are eligible, doesn't matter, in the presence of AGOA or not, those are duty-free into the United States. They also have been bolted on or retrofitted with an AGOA indicator. In other words, you can clear them, or the US importer can clear them under AGOA and under GSP. It does not matter. The impact is the same normally, except at the moment, during the expiry of the GSP, only AGOA can be used if you want to claim that preference. The light blue are those products that have been added by the AGOA legislation in 2000, so 23 years ago. There are roughly 1,800 tariff lines, which are not GSP duty-free, but are duty-free under AGOA. So the combined total between the two is around about 6,700, and of which roughly 5,000 are GSP and roughly 1,750 are those that are only eligible if exported from an AGOA country. And that's kind of almost where the additional benefit of AGOA lies, ignoring for a moment the fact that the GSP has expired. And I'll return to this a little bit later in terms of just a possible future scenario. What happens if AGOA does not get expired? What does this chart going to look like then for South Africa and Kenya, for example, because those countries are not considered least developed countries, and for other AGOA beneficiary countries. Okay, now just one slide briefly on the GSP. And the GSP is always very prominent in discussions and also the support offered by USAID at the moment under this current program. with Africa, the African Trade Investment Project. So the GSP precedes the African Growth and Opportunity. The GSP has been around since the 1970s, and it basically removed import duties on roughly, as it stands at the moment, around about 5,000 tariff lines. Now, what AGOA does is it attaches this SPI, Special Program Indicator, and that is essentially just an entry in the US tariff book. When you look up the duty-free statement status of your product, you will look out for a D indicator or an A for GSP. The GSP has an A indicator and the AGOA has a D indicator. If it's a D indicator, it is eligible for AGOA, and that is what must be used. Do not use the GSP at the moment. And in fact, don't use it ever in the presence while there's AGOA. It just will cause difficulties. The GSP is also something that needs to be reauthorized much more regularly than what AGOA has had to over the last couple of years. It expands the GSP coverage. So the 5,000 products that African countries, for example, and others were eligible for, expanded by 1,700 tariff lines to give us a total of roughly 6,750 tariff lines. So it's around about 5,050 GSP lines, add 1,700 under AGOA, extra under AGOA gives you a combined total of 6,750 plus minus of tariff lines into the United States that have the AGOA D indicator in the tariff book. In other words, they qualify for AGOA preferences. What AGOA also did is incorporated many sensitive products. So many products that the US has, out of principle, never allowed duty-free into its market are now part of AGOA. So there are quite a number of those, a couple of hundred of those. And then also, what is quite important, and that is especially for countries like South Africa and Kenya and countries that are not considered LDC countries, least developed countries, AGOA is in fact, I think I have it as a bullet point just now. I'm not going to jump the gun on this one. But and what it also does is it removes the so-called competitive need limits. And what the GSP does is, if a country exceeds a certain amount of products being imported in a certain category or in a certain product line into the United States in a given year, there's a risk of it being gradiated, that product being gradiated out of GSP preference status. So, for example, South Africa is a big exporter of oranges or a big exporter of macadamia nuts, as is Kenya, for example. Kenya and South Africa together account for 80% of the US import market of macadamia nuts. It's all going under AGOA. If it were going under the GSP, there'd be a good chance that those products would be gradiated out of the preference program, and that preferential status would be lost, and normal duties would apply. So AGOA does away with these CNLs, which, I mean, it's not a big issue in most categories, but certainly in some, as I've just mentioned, it would be an issue. South Africa has also at times been such a big export of oranges to the United States under AGOA, where it had almost 50% of the US import market. This is quite a few years back, because I tracked the data quite carefully over the years. But at some point, it was well over 40% of the US import market of oranges. That would run afoul of GSP rules quite quickly. The rules of origin, as I mentioned just now, very groundbreaking. They've never before been such flexible rules of origin for clothing. We could use fabric sourced from anywhere in the world, only have to make up the garment locally, and it qualifies under AGOA. And bearing in mind that apparel has very high import duties into the United States, many of those are the late 20s, if not 30% US import duties. Now, again, the exception here being South Africa. South Africa does not have the same flexible rules of origin for apparel. The longer time horizon, so the first initially AGOA was from 2000 to 2008, then 12, 15, and 25. Unlike the GSP, which generally tends to expire every 2 years, and then in about 6 or 7 of those times, so the last 20 years, the GSP expired before Congress acted and reauthorized it, meaning for a couple of months or longer. As at the moment, it's almost 2.5 years. There is no GSP, and importers cannot claim any preference at all, but they have AGOA as a fallback. What AGOA does not do, it does not remove import quotas. The United States does maintain a system of import quotas in various product categories, for example, tobacco and butter and cheese and and especially agricultural products, sugar, those are not taken away by AGOA, or peanut butter and peanut butter paste. Those are all subject to a quota, and some of those quotas have been utilized, fully utilized in a particular year, which means once it's out of a quota, it's a so-called tariff rate quota. Once it's out of quota, much higher import duties, or the duty-free status falls away effectively, and fairly high import duties are due. So AGOA does not do away with it. Trade remedy rules, those in South Africa might have been reading in the news how we have anti-dumping duties on our lemon juice exports, following a kind of a year-long investigation where South African exporters were found to be selling at less than fair value into the United States market, and they received a 75% import duty, punitive import duty, anti-dumping duty on their goods. So those things also don't fall away by through the AGOA legislation, meaning when you sell to the US market, do not sell less than at fair value. And in particular, do not sell less than what you're selling in your local market for, because you would very quickly run the risk of being considered to be dumping your goods in the US market. And then, of course, countries, as I mentioned earlier on, meeting the eligibility requirements. That is an ongoing thing. It is something that those in South Africa will know. It's been in the news quite a bit. There's been a lot of very poor reporting on the subject, but certainly there is a risk at the moment that South Africa is not fully complying with the AGOA eligibility requirements. And one of those requirements is not to undermine US foreign policy interests. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole and talk about that now, but it is a concern whether South Africa could lose its AGOA status at some point over something as such as that. Let me go. Okay. In terms of the link between AGOA and the GSP, and I've covered quite a bit of this now in the last couple of slides, but I think another important thing, especially if you're a South African exporter, is that what AGOA does not do is it does not use a differentiated approach, unlike the GSP. So the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, which has been around since the 1970s, it does not offer the same tariff product coverage. It's duty-free status, but the same product coverage, the same scale of benefits, or the same scope of benefits as AGOA does, and it's certainly not the same as to all countries in a consistent way. There are essentially three types of the GSP. There's a general GSP, which consists of around about 3,500 tariff lines out of the 5,100 tariff lines. There's a LDC only GSP component, which is another 1,500, 1,600 tariff lines, which is reserved for exports from least developed countries. And then there are a couple of tariff lines where certain countries are excluded, for example, because they've been gradiated out or they've hit the competitive need limits and so on. That's not so important now, but certainly the first two. The first one is South Africa's GSP is only 3,500 tariff lines. Compare to that with AGOA, which covers 6,700 tariff lines. So it is really a very small, insignificant, or almost insignificant comparison with what AGOA does. For LDCs, the coverage is much broader. So the full GSP applies for LDCs for a country like Lesotho and Namibia and Botswana and Malawi and so on, Mozambique. Those countries have the full LDC when it is in existence, when it is authorized. At the moment, it is not authorized, so there is no GSP at all. But just in terms of context, thinking forward as a potential fallback position, is all lost if there wasn't AGOA? Certainly not, but I'll address that point shortly. Now, looking ahead, before we go to slightly more practical parts of the presentation. And so the current expiry is September 25. There is a lot of talk about an extension. This obviously, 2 years to go, that is kind of getting to that time where importers and exporters want to have that certainty, and policy statements, a policy direction needs to be provided by the United States. It is a program that not only African exporters benefit from, but US importers benefit just as much from. So always two sides to the coin. A trade transaction has benefits and beneficiaries on both sides of the coin. The importer, consumer, the consumer in the importing country, the exporter, staff, etc. There are a lot of beneficiaries to to trade. It is not only the exporter that benefits from a preference program such as AGOA. So there is talk about a possible extension, but it is, I can't speculate. I'm obviously, hopeful that there'll be an extension because AGOA does not cost the United States much. Total US imports from AGOA countries are less than 1%. Total exports. That's not just the AGOA component, but total US imports from AGOA beneficiary countries last year were about 0.9% of total US imports. So it's a very small program in terms of the bigger picture. Doesn't cost the United States anything in terms of loss of revenue or loss of import duties. There's a small cost to continuing something such as AGOA, but it is up to the US Congress to consider. There is obviously the political dimension. A couple of things being considered, not just South Africa. That is just a very small part of it, but those east of Africa, China, Russia, and so on, they're all interested in Africa, and all interested in forging closer ties and having greater influence in Africa. And that is definitely weighing very heavily on the United States. Would they want to give that up? And would they want to concede that? I suspect absolutely not. And there's absolutely no reason why AGOA will not be reauthorized, but who knows? But it is certainly something that will be weighing on the US Congress as it considers these questions. The annual AGOA eligibility review, if you want to make a submission, you're welcome to. That process has recently been opened a couple of weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago. In fact, all the details are on the go.info website if you want to find them on the front page towards the bottom. How do you make a submission if you have a particularly strong view on something, on renewal or particular country's renewal, South Africa's renewal, please do participate in that process. It is taken quite seriously. There are hearings, there are online hearings. One can make just a paperwork, a written submission, but they all are considered when the United States considers its reauthorization of the country eligibility list for next year. The process starts now and will take a couple of months. There was an AGOA eligibility, or rather AGOA general review that was published about a month and a half ago. That took place over the last year and a bit, a large investigation. And essentially in a nutshell, the report found, it's a very long report, 300 pages, but it found that the impact of AGOA has been mixed. For some countries and some sectors, it has been significant. Overall, the impact has not been as much over the years as the United States would have liked to and wanted to. Now, that's either a good or bad thing if one thinks ahead in terms of what is the United States or what is Congress going to do with this information. One way of seeing it is maybe they will improve AGOA. Maybe they will maybe there will be special quotas for AGOA beneficiary countries, which are extended, even though quotas are not a major issue. But should the rules of origin be made even simpler? Should the 35% threshold be lowered to 25%, for example, whatever? There are various ways of, or should there just be more support for AGOA beneficiary countries to better utilize those preferences? And then fallback position, and that is just going back, what happens if AGOA expires? How do South African exporters, Malawian exporters, where do they stand? And I just have this little chart that I had earlier on. I've just extended it a little bit about what would happen under the current situation if AGOA was gone, but assuming that the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, has been reauthorized by now. It's never been unauthorized for as long as it has now, and they've been trying to reauthorize it, but it is a very politically fraught Congress at the moment, and getting anything done that requires support from both sides of the aisle is quite difficult, especially on fairly contentious subjects such as international trade and non-reciprocal trade preferences. But there are a lot of pushes to reauthorize the GSP. Now, the situation for a country like South Africa and Kenya will be vastly different, or significantly different to all the other countries, AGOA countries. And that is because the GSP for the non-LDC beneficiary countries like South Africa and Kenya are not as favorable as those for LDCs. So the situation, if AGOA is lost, or if South Africa even loses AGOA status before then, the situation is that obviously the general duty-free products which are around about 4,500 tariff lines. They stay, they are unaffected. That's the green bar in the middle. The blue at the bottom currently is AGOA and GSP. With AGOA falling away, only GSP remains. For South Africa, that means 3,500 tariff lines. For other countries, for the LDC countries, that means 5,000 tariff lines would still be eligible for duty-free access to the United States. Under the belt or under the line, the net sum, 30% of South Africa and Kenya's exports to the United States would be subject to a duty. That is assuming that the GSP has been reauthorized. Otherwise, it would be, and I'm just looking at my numbers at the moment, it would be 70%, 30 and 33, 63% of products would be subject to a duty. If in the presence of a GSP reauthorization and there not being AGOA, 30% of total products would be dutiable. The rest would be duty-free. And for LDC countries, only 17% would be dutiable. The rest would be duty-free. Including in those dutiable products would be textiles and clothing, for example. And that would be a massive problem for some of our neighboring countries like Lesotho and Eswatini and Malawi and so on, Madagascar. So the impacts would be quite serious, but for a country, certainly the impacts would be far more significant than for other countries. So just something to mull over. I wish I had a crystal ball to know exactly what is going to happen, whether AGOA is going to be renewed. And I don't really want to speculate, but what I'd like to say is that AGOA benefits both sides of the coin, both sides of the L, both sides of the Atlantic. For every successful export, there's a successful import and a happy importer and a happy US consumer. So I think that will be weighing on the mind of congressmen as they consider a renewal of AGOA. And of course, the political dimension, I think, is probably the most important dimension. And it is probably less about assisting Africa as opposed to not opening the door too far in that sense, or leaving a void for Russia and China and others to come in and take up the space that the United States has enjoyed in the sense. So I think those are the most important considerations probably going forward. Now, in terms of as an exporter, when you are engaging with a potential US importer, there are two important things that you need to consider. First of all, you need to, apart from everything that we've listened to early on, but purely from a paperwork perspective, from clearing those goods into the United States, the correct HTS classification code of your product, and then using that to determine the AGOA tariff status, AGOA or tariff status of your product. Is it AGOA eligible or not? And otherwise, what is the tariff? That is quite important to know. What the tariff is, are we looking at 27% or is it only 2.5%? Which, given the way the exchange rate has gone over the last year, seems to be a small cost to pay given the additional competitive advantage that the currency devaluation has brought along with it in terms of making products more competitive. What is also quite important, and I know the HS code has been mentioned, and there was a question early on, what is important in terms of the US imports and AGOA trade in particular, is you need the United States HTS classification code to establish the AGOA status of your product, not the South African or Malawian HS code. And maybe just a general code, and I know a comment, and this isn't just about codes and classifications today. The HS code system is an international system. Obviously, virtually every country applies it. Its customs applies it, and they use it for trade and trade data and so on and so forth, and labeling requirements and all kinds of other for all kinds of other reasons, trade remedies and so on. But it is only harmonized up to the 6th digit. In international trade, the 8th and the 10th digit are used, or particularly in the United States, the 10-digit code is used. So the 8th digit code is used to determine the AGOA status of a product, but when importing it, there are 10 digits, even if the last two are just 00. There is that last those last two codes, the last two numbers are also important when clearing goods into the United States. And there it does not help using the South African HS code. So if you know the HS code of your product because you've imported such goods in the past or you've exported exported such goods to Europe or to Namibia or another country, that is only an indicator, but is most likely not going to be the correct code. The first digits will be right, but not the next couple of digits. So it's important to refer to the US HS code or the HTS code when determining what is the HTS code for the correct product classification code for international trade purposes and customs purposes of your product. You can really ignore the South African code, except to help you along the way to establishing your correct code. The South African code, the South African 8-digit code, will not necessarily be the right code to use. And I think Rowan mentioned early on the potential problems of misclassifying goods and using the incorrect classification code can be dire, can be penalties, can hold up goods, can hold up shipments, can give you a black mark in the CBP and the customs book, and so on and so forth. So it is really important to use a correct and obtain and establish the correct HTS classification code. So what do you do in practice? And assuming now that you're not already familiar with the code for US purposes, ideally start with reviewing the chapter of your product that your product falls into. So the HS system is broken down into effectively 99 chapters, and in each chapter, and it's a very methodological process and system. So, for example, textiles and clothing will be in chapters 50 to 60, and then clothing 61 and 62, and then you get wood products in the 40s, and jewelry in 71, and automotives in 87, and machines in chapter 83, and so on. So effectively identify your correct product code initially by starting with the HTS chapter. And you can download that chapter from the United States International Trade Commission website, or you can also find it on the go.info. There's a whole list, and that actually, incidentally, also the document that you are downloading on the go.info is the original document from the United States. It links off the server of the United States. It is not something that is that's just been republished. It is actually a direct link to the United States International Trade Commission, and gets that document from there. So that would normally help you, and it is important not only to to give you a better overview of your sector and the products that fall into that chapter. But also what is quite important is there are a lot of notes in the chapter that have to be read and have to be consulted. So sometimes the notes, for example, give you guidance with classification. I remember looking at I think it was ceramic cutlery or ceramic knives. Is that a ceramic product or is that cutlery? Different chapters, and the guidance is provided in the chapters how to correctly classify a knife with a ceramic blade. Is it a ceramic product or is it a knife? So that guidance is provided by the notes. Very important to refer to those notes. They help you along. And then also just bearing in mind that many tariff lines, especially once you get to the 10th digit level, so the 8th digit is needed to determine the AGOA status of your product and what the import duty is. The 10th digit is required for import purposes, for the paperwork purposes, and bear in mind that many of those last two digits are so-called other, or NESOI, not elsewhere specified or included. So a product might be, a tariff code might have 3 or 4 tariff codes at the 8-digit level for your product or thereabouts. And then if you do not fall into one of those 4, then you would fall into the other. If you are sure, obviously, that you fall within that category or within that heading, and you've worked down that tree, so to speak, of establishing the correct tariff code for your product, and certainly the 10th digit code, there's a good chance that it falls under other or such and such products, not elsewhere specified or included. And that's almost a negative list. If it doesn't fall into the positive list and is specifically defined, it falls into the so-called negative list as part of that under that same heading or within that same heading. On the go.info website, there are many ways of skinning this cat and finding this information. So you can certainly go to the United States International Trade Commission. They have what seems to and what is a little bit of a complex system, but it is entirely possible to review your tariff line and find your correct tariff classification code via that system. Or on the go.info, we've made it a lot simpler, and we've created a tool which if you navigate to ago.info, www.ago.info, on the front page or in one of the subpages, which I'll get to just now, you have a input tool which allows you to search for your correct tariff code, either by inputting the tariff code or part of the tariff code. It can be 4 digits, 5 digits, 6 digits that you have, and then you start searching based on that, or a keyword or key phrase or 2-3 words that you have into the second field, sorry, the first field, and the code into the second field. The site is also programmed in such a way that you do not have spaces or dots in between. It forces you to remove them, or rather it removes them automatically for you. So if you have a copy and pasted code that is 10 digits or 8 digits long, but it's got a couple of dots in between, the site automatically removes all of those, the dots, and just enters the pure number. And then you can literally click on start your search, and the system will give you information on any hits based on your search criteria. And not just does it tell you then what is the AGO status of your product, but also what is the MFN tariff, what is the normal import duty if the product is not AGO eligible, if it comes from your competitor country, from a competing export in another country, or if it doesn't meet the rules of origin, or something else is not entered correctly on the paperwork, that you cannot claim the import duty, or the duty-free status rather. Then normal duties are applicable. So that's quite important. It also helps you a little bit with market research. If the normal import duty on a product is 15% or 20%, you can use that information with your importer and your buyer on the United States side in explaining that if you are the exporter, being in an AGO-eligible country, they can claim that 15% import duty, which they cannot claim when importing from another country. So it automatically makes your product more competitive and more attractive to the importer potentially. It's also very very mobile friendly, the site. So if you just go via your phone, you'll see there on the screen the top input field is where you can put a keyword in, or alternatively put in a part code or the full code of your product that you think is the correct code, and double check and press start your search, and it'll navigate you to the results field, which we can do in fact, I'll just go to the next page. This is essentially what, if I input the word cocoa, these are the hits or the tariff lines that contain the word, or some of the tariff lines, I think there are probably a few more than this, tariff lines that contain the word cocoa. Because you have a product with cocoa, you might have a sugar confectionery containing cocoa, or not containing cocoa, or nuts containing cocoa, or not containing cocoa, or yogurt with cocoa in, or whatever. These are just a few. The list is actually much longer on products that contain the word cocoa. So if you're doing a keyword search, this is essentially what the results field would look like. The first one, then you can obviously navigate down a little bit, but you'll see in the far left corner is the HTS code, the 8-digit HTS code. That's the one to determine your AGO preference status or not. Then there's the full description of your product. Make sure that meets your product, that is the best fit for your product. The next column is the AGO status. And because this is a static page now, I can't show you the little drop down menu, but there are a couple of options which I'll show you on a live site just now. The GSP status and MFN tariff. So that's all, and then the actual duty, the MFN tariff. And the MFN duty, just to reiterate again, the MFN duty, MFN is basically, the United States also calls it the NTR, normal tariff relations duty. That is this exports from any country coming to the United States that are not being entered under preference. That's the standard duty. There is a so-called column 2 tariff, which applies to North Korea and Russia and Cuba, but we've actually removed that there was this creating a little bit of unnecessary distraction, and it's not really relevant to exporting from African countries. So essentially, that already gives you a bit of market intelligence on your potential product, because it gives you the AGO status, the D-AGO. D is the special program indicator I mentioned earlier on. GSP status, is it also GSP eligible? So a US import can technically claim duty-free status under GSP and under AGO, or either or rather, except at the moment when the GSP is suspended or has not been reauthorized. And the third one is the import duty that is due if preferences aren't claimed, or secondly, as I mentioned earlier on, if the product does not originate in the exporting countries. In other words, it contains too many non-originating input materials, and it does not meet that 35% local content and processing threshold. So that is quite important. If it does not meet that, but it's still a product being exported by South Africa, it would not fall under AGOA, even if it has the AGOA status, because it is not originating in South Africa. So that's always just something to keep at the back of the mind. But I think this maybe looks a bit abstract. Let's do a quick practical demo over a minute or two. I know we are running out of time, but I'm going to just quickly share, do a new share. Just give me 2 secs. Okay, I just need to share this. Okay, am I sharing? I think I'm sharing a new page now. At least I hope I am. Otherwise, please, someone shout. Yeah, okay, thank you. Let me just quickly actually navigate back to, I'm just clicking on the AGOA.info logo bit. So on the front page of AGOA.info, you can see there's a lot of information already on the front page. I mentioned earlier on the eligibility review. If you click on here, you get to all the information and the contact details and the requirements for submitting a review or a submission rather. That's a little bit further down, but that's not discussion for today. Here's the tool, how to find and check your AGOA eligibility status. And so, for example, I'm just going to COCA. See, I've done it before. It already comes up. And then I can press start your search. And it takes me to the back end, so to speak, the results page that I was on early on. Here are the products. So basically, the first column are the tariff lines. Is the tariff classification code, the 8-digit tariff classification code. Very important. This is to establish the correct AGOA status or not, or preferential status of your product. Here's the description. Make sure it is matches. You can see how many tariff lines have the word COCA in. I chose one with lots. In fact, there are 80 tariff lines. There's a little number here. 80 tariff lines that have the word COCA in. So just be sure that you choose the correct one. So there, for example, I'm seeing here one product here towards the bottom, chocolate and preparations, whatever. Not AGOA, not GSP, 37.2 cents per kilogram plus 6% is the import duty. So it gives you that kind of information. No preferences can be obtained. But yeah, let's start at the top. So I mentioned earlier on the third column, I couldn't give you a drop-down menu. I'm just clicking on it to show you the drop-down menu and our GSP drop-down menu. So the first one, if it is a D, all products that are AGOA eligible have a D indicator, special program indicator. So you can also do a query, COCA, but you only want to show those that are AGOA eligible. I'm going to do that now. Click on D, and I'm going to click Go again. And now it's filtering only products with the word COCA in, with the correct tariff classification codes that contain the word COCA and are AGOA eligible. And the GSP status we have set to all, meaning any GSP program indicator showed up here. We can also have only those that are non-GSP, for example. Let's do that, for example. I'm going to do that quickly now. Press go again. I have to scroll down because I've got the video links here on the right-hand picture. Clicking go. Nothing. Okay. So COCA, there is no COCA product, no product containing the word COCA, rather, in the US tariff book that is AGOA eligible, but not GSP eligible. In other words, where does AGOA give me something that GSP does not give? There's nothing. Okay. So I'm going to do all again and press OK. And you can see all of those. And in other words, the GSP provides as many preferences as AGOA does for products containing the word COCA, except, as I mentioned earlier on, there is no GSP at the moment. So all of these products do not have an AGOA status. They might, a GSP status. So they might have a special program indicator indicating it is GSP eligible, but only when the GSP is enforced. The GSP is not authorized at the moment. There is no GSP claim to be made. You can only make an AGOA claim if you want to export to the United States duty-free. And here in the final corner are those tariff lines. You can see some of them are very high, 20% and so on is certainly considered very high by international standards for a tariff. What you can also do, you can use this for market research. So I mean, as I mentioned just now, you can, if you are, you can only an A+. So basically, maybe I should just mention the different GSP programs. And there's a little description here, which used to be a fairly long list, but we've made it into, concertina type, blend in and blend out. Guide to classification codes and preference program indicator. Just a small guide to help you with your queries here. So the GSP status, there's the A, all GSP products, sorry, all GSP countries. A+, only the LDCs, least developed beneficiary countries, and A* are those where there's certain countries that are excluded. But A+, if you're an exporter from South Africa, you can do A+ here, and we'll do another query. So it needs to be AGOA and A+. So these products that are A+ are those that only least developed countries would benefit from if it weren't for AGOA. And because there is no, sorry, if it weren't for AGOA and there's only GSP, only the least developed countries could claim benefits. No other countries, not South Africa under the GSP. And then just the general A, you can also do a query there, and also to see again a comparison. Those products here that have an A and are AGOA eligible would be eligible from South Africa in the absence of AGOA. So they fall under the general GSP scheme and they fall under AGOA. Both of them are applicable. The US importer can use either, except at the moment when there's no GSP. But if the GSP gets reauthorized, theoretically they can use both, or practically they can use both. I would advise against using a GSP if you can avoid it because of this issue of reauthorization. Rather use AGOA and let the US importer claim that duty-free status right away. And that is something you can use in your discussions, in your meetings with your, the B2B meetings we mentioned earlier on. That is something really important that you can bring up. You have a program, you have a product, you've done your research, and do your research here as well and indicate to the buyer that the product is AGOA eligible and what is the GSP status. Doesn't matter what the status is at the moment. Tell them there is no GSP at the moment. So AGOA gives that very important preferential advantage, preference margin, big advantage over other countries, sourcing from other countries, because there's no GSP. If there is a GSP, you can also mention to them, normally only an LDC country would be eligible for duty-free access, but because of AGOA, the importer can also enter it into the United States or clear it through customs on a duty-free basis. So you can play around with these permutations, these conditional queries. Yes, it must be AGOA, and it must be a GSP or must not be GSP, or it must be GSP only for LDC countries, and so on and so forth. It allows you to do to get quite a bit of market or extract information that you can present to your buyers in terms of how they can benefit from it, because the US buyer, and with no disrespect to any clearing agent on the United States side, but the fact that so many imports from African countries, including from South Africa, jewelry, for example, there's a lot, we are exporting South Africa is exporting about $400 million in 2022 worth of jewelry, gold jewelry into the United States under AGOA. Quite a bit of that, or it is all eligible under AGOA. Quite a bit of it is coming under GSP. Those goods will not have obtained duty-free clearance. So it's a deferred clearance, or rather not a deferred clearance, a deferred duty saving that they will get at some stage in future if the GSP and when the GSP gets reauthorized, and if the GSP provision says those goods cleared under GSP in the interim, while the GSP was unauthorized or not reauthorized by Congress, can now make a claim for that import duty that they paid at the time of the last 2 years. but it's not an ideal situation. The importer wants to be competitive and wants to get the best price now, not at some future stage, because it's very difficult doing business, not knowing whether you're going to get those 20% back at some point in the future and when that has happened, and it's cash and capital and so on tied up in it. And ultimately, the importer is probably going to make the exporter responsible for it. They're going to say, exporter, drop your prices by 15% because we are having to pay 15% import duty. And but we need your product to be competitive. So let's meet somewhere halfway or whatever. It's not ideal. Tell them it is eligible under GOA and that claim for duties can be made right away. So again, I don't think this really truly does it justice. You need a bit of time to play around with this, but use your product that you are potentially exporting. Either put HTS codes in here, put a description in or keyword in here, find your product and look around those products, what others are paying or would have to pay. What is the general duty? If your US importer sources from elsewhere, they have to pay that duty. What is the GOA status? What is the GSP status at the moment? Irrespective of the GSP status, there is no GSP to claim to be made at the moment. Point these things out to the US importer because the GOA is what gives you that special foot in the door and means the US importer does not have to pay import duties on those goods if they are GOA eligible and have a D indicator. I didn't mention earlier on the textiles and clothing. These, and I'm just mentioning it now, just in case there's a textiles and clothing exporter or producer here in the room. The HS classification code D, or the special program indicator, has not been added to textiles and apparel because they are subject to special rules of origin provisions. They're actually under Chapter 98. There are special provisions where you import according to the rules of origin category, not necessarily the normal Chapter 6102 or whatever the code might be for that product, and they do not have that D, but they are still GOA eligible. And obviously the other criteria is that the product has to have this wearing apparel provisions system in place, like most GOA countries do have in place, and they've had it since the early 2000s. So that's generally not an issue, certainly not an issue in South Africa and any of these regional countries, but just something to bear in mind. You can do a search purely for apparel or textile goods because they are subject to different rules. So we've differentiated that a little bit in this database. But certainly GOA is D and and the GSP is A. But keep an eye on the GOA status and use this as a secondary query tool only for purposes of strengthening your argument with the US importer of why they should be buying from you and not from another country that is normally is normally GSP eligible, because the GSP is expired at the moment. And then going forward, when the GSP gets reauthorized, be aware, use this information to know that your competitors in another country can claim duty-free status, or those goods are subject to duty-free status when imported into the United States, because now the GSP has been reauthorized. And if it is a plus product, it's all countries that are GSP eligible. If it's a S-star, then it is only the least developed countries that can claim, or products from least developed countries that can claim preference status. And in the interest of time, in fact, just half a minute maybe. If you navigate to the top of the to the menus here, this first column here under About GOA, there's the fourth or fifth or sixth, the sixth sub-menu item, United States tariff schedule by chapter. Okay, you can click on that and download all of the chapters, and you can see what it's about. So this here, again, it links directly to the United States International Trade Commission database. It is not something just reposted or republished. These are the original files that download off the US ITC server, and you can use those to read the notes on your product, and where the notes provide guidance on how to classify the product. It is really quite important not to get this wrong. And one small little new section that's been added actually the other day, CBP classifications, origin, and GOA eligibility rulings. Again, as you do if you're battling on how to classify correctly your product, have a look at previous rulings that clarify how certain products need to be classified. that clarify the go status, that clarify whether the rules of origin have been met, whether the product has been substantially transformed. And then there are also a couple of links here. How can you obtain a ruling if you're unclear? And if you need to be sure before you embark on this export process that that product will be treated in a certain way by US Customs based on a binding ruling letter and a clarification. So the details are in these links. They actually link straight to the US Customs and Border, but it's just kind of, there's so much information on their side. This just takes a couple of important links and makes it easy for you to find them. Thank you very much for that, and thanks for your patience. I've gone over my time again. Thank you.
Thanks, Eckart. As usual, quite detailed and insightful. I think these things are quite hard to summarize because they're so in depth and there's so much information when it comes to looking at them. But thank you so much. I don't see there is something. No, it was a question here regarding samples and freight, more for Rowan, so it wasn't for you. But yeah, I think the key on this is to utilize the site. Please don't be shy of using it. It's there for you to use. You've got to jump on it. You've got to try and work it. If it doesn't work out for you, that's what we're here for. Give us a shout. We'll try help you out with it. If we can't, then we will get hold of Eckart and ensure that he's giving advice on what is not coming up. It could just be a terminology thing that you're dealing with. So that is exactly why the customer service support program is here for you. But other than that, thank you very much, Eckart. Thank you. Great to have you on board again, and thanks to all of our other speakers today. Yeah, really insightful information coming through, and really good to know it's not all that completely daunting. Obviously, there's a process to go through, but it can be done. So do not shy away from exporting your products to the US. There's a lot of people ready to help you and get you into the market. So please make sure to utilize our services. I've shared the link on the chat, but we will also be reaching out to all of you after this, and trying to set up some calls and assistance with that. But thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think that's it for today.